Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's book talk. Today, we've got Erin Lin, who's an associate professor of political science from The Ohio State University. Um, Professor Lin's work is super interesting, as you'll find out more today if you have not already looked at the book. Um, she's really interested in how war affects economic development, agriculture, genocide, the legacy of war, but really focusing on a topic that I think we haven't really focused on much in the international relations literature of like what happens after the war and what happens with everything that's still on the ground and still unexploded. So her book today, When the Bomb Stopped, addresses what happens when these undetonated bombs from the Vietnam War still affect rural communities. She was also just 2 months ago awarded the prestigious Fulbright Hayes Faculty Research Abroad Award. And she's going to go to Cambodia for 4 months to look at how Cambodians and civilians during the Vietnam War really understood and what their experiences were after the war. So we're very excited to have her here. As a reminder, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And so Professor Lin, take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Maggie. Share screen. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's really an honor to be able to present my research in front of a new set of faces. Today, I'm going to talk and really give you a brush clearing sense of what's in my book. The book talks about the long-term impact of bombing. And across these three main empirical chapters, I grapple with the economic implications, the social consequences, as well as the political ones. Now, today, I won't be going into a tremendous amount of depth into any one of them, but I anticipate and eagerly await questions on any of the chapters we'll be talking about, as well as the theories involved. Okay, so this is the title of the book, When the Bomb Stopped, The Legacy of War in Rural Cambodia. And in it, the book really has as much detail about bombing as it does about Cambodian life. On the bomb side, I talk about how bombing technology has advanced in the past half century. It's become more lethal, even though not always more precise. I also write about the policymakers and the political scientists who saw the advantages of these bombing technologies. And there's some history of science in there as well, because I talk about the R&D failures of our bombs, as well as the technologies that we have developed to clear and remove leftover undetonated bombs. On the other side of it, it's also very much a book about rural Cambodia. I describe what it's like to grow rice, to live in these Khmer farmhouses that are on stilts above the rice paddies, and what the gossip is around town. So the rumors going around, the hidden transcripts that reveal these problems between the commercial landowners, the Macha, and the subsistence farmers, the Nyaktomara. Now, the theory that I'm presenting in the book, like in a nutshell, it's about how underdevelopment arises. And it's not from the normal explanations, not from lack of resources or bad geography or bad economic policy or of a lack of technological capacity. But it's from a war that ended a half century ago, from weapons that were intended to send this message of strength, a message that ideally would end the war earlier. But it's these weapons that ultimately failed to detonate at high rates. And these are the weapons that explain these localized patterns of poverty and food insecurity. I will say that the goal isn't to explain patterns of US bombing, but instead I'll show you how bombing led to different patterns of development across Cambodia. And I'll also show later that it cannot be easily reversed. So that's the broad idea. This picture on the title slide harkens back to the original title of the book, Dangerous Ground. It was changed partially because the reviewer says that that sounds just like a bad Liam Neeson movie. But what you see in the picture is that there is a blue 42 cluster bomb. It's actually the round object to the right of the wooden post. And then below that, you see a sign that in Khmer it says Brayut Grup Min Don Pdu, which just means be careful, there's an explosive that has not yet exploded. All right. So I'll give you a quick overview of the book. First, in terms of the setting. The title is not wrong. This is a book about Cambodia, That's a small country in Southeast Asia that's never been a big deal in political science. But I think that's exactly why it's important. It's a country that's very much been impacted by the US, by our foreign policy during the Vietnam War. Just brief history primer, we had these US aerial attacks during the Vietnam War over Cambodia, known as the US secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos. And this was part of our efforts to break up the communist supply lines that ran from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia to South Vietnam. Now, it's the impact of these bombings that I argue that we've really forgotten about. And in some ways, I think Americans have never comprehensively examined our role really in this like systematic exploration of the statistical military record, paired with this deeper understanding of what life has become for people on the ground. The puzzle of the book originated from a lot of this field work that I did during graduate school. The puzzle is that in Cambodian agriculture, you see these uneven patterns of development and productivity. So oddly, some of the most fertile parts of land of Cambodia, farms on the most fertile areas, they're also the least productive, even though they have a lot of other things going for them. Even though they're near roads, they're very accessible, and they have smart, hardworking farmers who own the land and working them. They're still farming at a minimal level of productivity. So the question is why? Now, my approach really relies on examining the impacts of bombing from a bottom-up perspective. So in that way, it's a very anthropological book. 2 out of the 3 main chapters are built on ethnographic observation. And that's actually a lot of what's potentially new here and worth arguing about. To me, this is part of an effort to rethink historical legacies and the legacies of war literature so that we can kind of get outside our usual methodological framework. It's a very econometric one where you take spatial data of a historical event, you merge it with contemporary outcomes that are quite localized, and you typically take a plausible guess as the mechanisms. And that characterizes a lot of HPE, historical political economy research since Asimogu, Johnson, and Robinson. That's not really a criticism. Their work has launched ships, including my own, like HAPS and World Politics articles. But I think there's a different way that we can start thinking about HPE. And we can think about ways to turn to the field to ground truth a lot of these findings, beyond just finding these plausible pieces of evidence of the mechanism, but also adding nuance to our characterizations of individuals. We can find these surprising consequences that we might not have found behind a laptop and narrate our findings to a larger audience more effectively and powerfully. So that's my little soapbox, where I'm going to call for increased attention to like invest in language, visiting areas often, and developing these long-term relationships, really kind of committing to area studies. All right, then the argument. So the argument here in some ways is simple. It's that bombs fail to go off when they hit soft ground. The unexploded ordnance left behind leaves behind the sphere of fear that limits productivity, amplifies ethnic tensions, and ironically, leaves farmers protected from the country's economic elite who have been grabbing land for commercial plantations. I will say you really have to read the book to appreciate the heterogeneity of the individuals impacted and the variety of ways that the consequences of war will kind of spill out from it. But I hope by the end of the presentation, you'll want to buy the book, get it from the library, or at the very least, cite it. All right, so I'll do a quick kind of overview of each chapter. And so chapter 1 starts with the theory. Where exactly it fits, what's new, what's different, have I read something like this before? Because there is a legacies of war literature that focuses on the developmental effects of bombing. This is mostly in Dev Econ and development economics. You have at Columbia 2 economists, Don Davis and Weinstein, and they examine Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombing, and they show how both cities experienced this population boom that reinvigorated the depleted workforce and brought back those economies to life. Economists from the Netherlands applied a similar approach to analyze the impact of bombing on post-war Germany, and they reached similar conclusions. Bombing only left behind this temporary impact on urban growth, and then these urban economies quickly rebounded. Of course, when you think about these two particular cases, these could be very specific to the story of post-World War II economic recovery, right? So you have industrialized nations, the bombs were largely targeted on urban areas, and you also have military historians like Tammy Biddle argue that these bombs were relatively imprecise and they weren't actually that good at destroying factories. Um, so there's this question of like, what can that particular time tell us about, say, Southeast Asian development after the Vietnam War and its bombings? Now, it turns out that for the past 10 years, the scholarly narrative around post-war Southeast Asia has actually followed this same trajectory, the same story. It's been led by economists from Berkeley, Ted Miguel and Roland Durand. And they find that bombings have no long-run impact on Vietnam's like district level population density, poverty rate, consumption, literacy, access to public goods. They do use like causal inference and more granular data, but the argument is still the same. It's due to capital's ability to regenerate and redistribute after war. This is kind of neoclassical growth theory in economics. Now, this theory gets you somewhat close, but it doesn't get quite as far as the claim that I'm making to get you to explain some of these patterns in Cambodia. Because in Cambodia, you see some aspects of the story. You see this booming population, like now it's 3 times larger than it was in 1960. You have more and more agricultural capital entering the country. So since 2004, the number of rice mills have doubled, the water pumps have doubled, the number of tractors have tripled, rice threshers have tripled, and the number of power tillers have increased eightfold. And thanks to development programming from like USAID, the World Bank, and the Cambodian Ministry of Agriculture, this capital is being distributed throughout the provinces. But my argument here is that we need to pay closer attention to local geography, in particular where a bomb's trigger fuse usually will fail to go off upon impact. Those are the areas that leave behind these large quantities of unexploded ordnance. And it turns out that these impact fuses fail to go off when they hit soft ground cover. So in Southeast Asia, that means the lush, verdant rice paddies that grow rice all year long. My respondents reveal this reversal of fortune that takes place on Cambodia's most fertile land. So for an array of people, from like the village chiefs of the highland tribes to the urban migrants from Phnom Penh to soldiers who had fled the Khmer Rouge, among all of these different types of people, you see a sphere of fear hang over their communities, ultimately leading economic growth to stall out. So the like tagline for this section is that unexploded ordnance essentially removes the fertility advantage of high fertility land. Now, this seems intuitive, but the hard part is actually like tracking down the respondents to get them to like open up about themselves and talk about their lives. And it's hard to describe people. So this is where we move from political science to political ethnography. And this is what happens in chapter 2. So you meet key respondents like Manare Lang, and you learn what life is like from the perspective of the bombed. From these interviews, I'll pull out a couple of things that we learned. So first, farmers will actually adapt their farming behavior when they're living around unexploded ordnance, and this results in very cautious farming. So people will farm more with hand tools rather than machines. For example, you'll use like a machete to hand harvest rice rather than a harvester. They also tend to work more slowly to keep an eye out for unexploded ordnance, and they work minimal amounts of land, typically the land that is like right next to their house. I argue that these short-term adjustments actually accumulate in the long term and lead to underproduction and poverty in the long term. And so it's this idea that like these effects are kind of building up over a long period of time. They're not emerging suddenly, and like history matters. And also like it makes you kind of question this idea that peace is a thing that happens at the end of war, which is something that you might think if you study like war length or war termination. In reality, a lot of these people might be living in technically a post-conflict area, but there still is this real fear for your life from these ancient military weapons, and that fear exists on a daily basis. So I also quantitatively test this theory. I use a historical data set of U.S. Air Force sorties flown over Cambodia from 1965 to 1973. This is their geocoded payload drops and there's also data on like the tonnage of each payload drops as well as the types of bombs that come out. I use Ministry of Agricultural soil charts and also Ministry of Interior's contemporary household survey that measures things like household assets and income, in addition to the Cambodian agricultural census. So that gives you information of the georeference plot of each land, the crop productivity, the land usage, but also alternative forms of land usage. So the types of animals that are being reared in terms of numbers of poultry, cows, pigs, the amount of fish being harvested in fish ponds, and also the amount of family outmigration. I also took pains to collect pre-treatment measures of population density, so the proportion of village boundaries that contain agricultural fields are also another measure that I code, as well as transit areas, so pre-bombing roads and riverways. And this design really relies on a comparison. So first, the comparison between bombed high fertility plots and non-bombed high fertility plots. So what you see is the marginal effect of bombing on the high fertility plots on the right-hand side of each plot. And then also on the comparison between bombed low fertility plots versus non-bombed low fertility plots. So this could give you both a measure of what the effect of like bombing is across low and high fertility soils, but also remember the difference between low fertility soils and high fertility soils is that on low fertility soils, you typically have the bombs all explode upon impact. So there's going to be no residual unexploded ordnance left compared to the high fertility plots where those, once they've been bombed, they're still high risk for unexploded ordnance. And that's why I find that it's on those specific plots that you actually find a 2/3 drop in rice production and a 40% reduction in income compared to the unbombed high fertility controls. And the point that I want to make here is that to me, these qualitative and quantitative methods really work in tandem, where the statistical models really indicates how the experiences highlighted at the beginning of the chapter from the ethnographic observation and interviews, they really index these broader inequities in Cambodian society. The chapter following that considers the social implications of living with unexploded ordnance. I visit one multi-ethnic commune called Hbak, and I find that my respondents' descriptions of themselves really move beyond the classic tropes of war victims. So you don't have trauma just like freezing one's imagination and forcing these like repetitive risk-averse behaviors. Instead, you see trauma influencing this cultural script where there's this new set of like moral rights and wrongs through this lens of leftover bombs. In other words, like they're creating these new codes of conduct, like the best ways to live among an unexploded ordnance. But it's based on these different cultural conceptions of violence and one's ability to control it. So in this particular commune, there is an indigenous minority, the Tempuan, and then the ethnic majority group, the Khmer. And you see the Khmer neighbors like use gossip and rumors of the Tempuan behaving irresponsibly, of like tossing bombs to one another, of like name calling the Tempuan as like uneducated and not smart. And this like reinforces stereotypes, but it also serves as this device to like warn the Khmer children about the hidden dangers of unexploded ordnance. So now you've just heard about like the two main empirical chapters about how these leftover bombs are bad for me, and they also enhance like ethnic stereotypes. I think it's a matter of temperament, like those of us with more of a progressive bent might think we then have like an obligation to remove these faulty bombs. The first thing I'll say about the process of removing unexploded ordnance is that, you know, the technologies have improved in how we kind of identify and detect bombs from false positives, like scrap metal, but the removal process like, of physically getting the bomb out is still the same. So you have like one deminer with some type of magnetic metal detector or like a dog trained to sniff out explosives and like they sweep a suspected area. When there's a particularly spot, like a spot that's noted, then a second deminer will like get on the ground and generally like dig the area to find the buried object in order to expose and identify it. If it is identified as a bomb, then the team will either try to defuse it, but more likely they'll just plant a charge on top of it so it can be blown up from a distance. When you compare demining now as it was done about 30 or 40 years ago. The main difference is our detectors. The detectors are more accurate now. Now we use these dual sensor detectors called large loops. They emit these electromagnetic induction with ground penetrating radar. So what's good is that like these are relatively small, low powered radar units that can emit back these signals that reflect um, these 3D images of either the plastic or the metal items that are hidden in the soil. And that's actually what you see in this picture, where you have a deminer, a one-person team pushing one of these large loops across the ground. Um, so bomb removal almost seems like this like intuitive, like clear and obvious solution, because you have this one intervention and it can solve potentially these multiple problems like saving lives, making work safer, lifting these farmers out of poverty. And there's a very attractive, um, honestly, like tech-based parsimony to that. It's also attractive and parsimonious because it's the like the idea that the same intervention in like you can use that in multiple contexts in the same ways. So like you have deminers around the world training with the same manuals using similar techniques and equipment. Now, the argument I make in this chapter is that these seemingly simple technocratic solutions are rarely simple in practice or in reality. And policies that seem reasonable in theory can actually fail in practice, especially if it ignores politics. This begs the question, like, what are the politics of Cambodia? And it is authoritarian. There's no real opposition party. It's ruled by a kleptocratic elite right now, run by Hun Manet. And there's a very weak judiciary that's influenced by political elites. So I find that mine removal programs, bomb removal programs, they actually recalibrate the environmental milieus in rural Cambodia. Because on the one hand, you have demining improving like personal safety and briefly improving economic prospects. But on the other hand, the same endowments that make land economically attractive also make it geopolitically vulnerable. So what I find from the ethnography is that there's a bunch of people living in these post-mined, post-cleared farms that are functioning in limbo, where they're competing against these cronies of the state who want to expropriate their land for commercial development. In Ratchanakiri province, where I do the majority of my field work, I see that like demining efforts paired with the economic growth of the area has pushed up the value of land. So it makes land speculation one of the most lucrative businesses in the area. My respondents show that local authorities will actually abet political elites in transferring land ownership out of the hands of villagers. And then they reclaim the land under the pretext of using it to provide public goods, in this case, commercial development, providing more jobs for people. Then it turns out that higher level political officials at the province level will use these legal loopholes in the Cambodia 2001 land law to designate that the seized land is their own private property. And so there's this irony in it because as much as the international humanitarian demining community, as much as we might try to fix our mistakes in removing bombs that were left behind, we can actually leave the people that we are trying to help worse off. So that takes us to the conclusion, and I can't get to all of it right now just because I'm a little over time. But I will go to one thing, which is like, what exactly is the lesson here? Because I think these findings raise these really important questions for students of like civic engagement in American politics. I think we really need to ruminate about what this means in terms of the obligations of the American citizen, because in many ways, like the costs of our personal human security, like the actions that we take in pursuit of our national security, have these unforeseen consequences. And in this case, has taken away the liberties of Cambodian farmers. My answer is that the American political community should connect more to the experience of victims of American military violence. Because I think only by like informing ourselves and caring about others and being curious about the world outside of ourselves, can we really start to feel the true weight of our military actions? And I think this can start with us like in political science. I remember in graduate school, like much of what I was learning in the IR literature about bombing, it focused more on these traditional outcome variables, like global balance of power, military outcomes, likelihood of winning war, and how this impacts things like deterrence, coercion, and bargaining. Now, my argument in the conclusion is that these are actually really top-down perspectives and our usual interpretations of bombing's effects and security studies that really is more from the perspective of the global power. Tom Schelling in Arms and Influence, one of his arguments in the introduction is that, like, we have this responsibility to make war shorter with these improved weapons and technologies. I don't think that's a very satisfactory explanation, though, for the impacts of war. And I'm very inspired by this like rising subset of other IR scholars who study the human costs of war, like Netta Crawford and Nisha Faisal, that work to quantify and document the casualty rates on both sides. And I hope that this book adds a little bit of a different element to that, how knowing area studies, doing your field work, you can more vividly describe bombing from the perspective of the victims. And that will be helpful overall, not just to us in academia, but hopefully the larger US constituency as well. I have normally other things to talk about too in the conclusion in terms of applications of the effects of unexploded ordnance and the way that we use cluster musicians still to this day in wars since the Vietnam War. But I will keep that for the Q&A since I know I'm a bit over time. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks you, Erin, so much for providing such an interesting talk. Okay, so since you left it open for Q&A, let me ask you, when we think about clusters munitions or landmines or other types of unexploded ordinances, when we see increasing use, so I'm thinking about not just like our American involvement in war, but thinking about the current conflicts that have been happening or recently happened. So thinking about Ukraine and Russia, thinking about Yemen, thinking about places like Gaza. Um, what do you think the like long-term impact will be in some of these places? And I think it's so interesting how you point out sort of counterintuitively, like the best land means the like least likely to explode. So as you're thinking about this moving forward, what would you like if you were going to talk to Zelensky or if you were going to talk to Ukrainians, like how would you tell them to start thinking about this and start planning for after the war? That's really hard. I'm sorry.
It's really hard, but it's a very important question. Because there's a couple of things that the issue of Ukraine and also just contemporary applications and issues around unexploded ordnance bring up. And I think the first is that you do see just a limited budget of dedicated to humanitarian demining, essentially getting shift from like one post-war scenario to another. I work a little bit in the humanitarian demining space. And I think it was amazing to see the amount of national programming that was at first dedicated to cases like in Southeast Asia and in Western and Eastern Africa. Those programs were closing down entirely because so much attention was being geared towards Ukraine and their unexploded ordnance issues that the amount of U.S. The amount of U.S. money that we've dedicated to it, as well as the amount of international attention that's dedicated to current events issues, basically, I think, changed the country-specific programming. What's ironic about the Ukraine case is that, according to humanitarian law, like deminers cannot work in active conflict zones. And so you see a lot of money going into a country where you actually can't do that much demining yet. And a lot of these issues are on pause. So I think from the humanitarian space, there is this question of like, we do want to help Ukraine. But right now, all of that money is essentially frozen, and it would have been a better use just going back to the original countries that they're taken from. So in some ways, like the advice would be, we understand that the issue is going to be very important. But right now, the immediate concern would actually be thinking about how the funds would be used better elsewhere. I think there is this question. I mean, it's weird to think about what peace means nowadays compared to what it meant before, I think. And I think the book really ends in this kind of very like realistic note where like war is never going to end, and there's always going to be this demand for people to want to contain other armies and other militaries and to either keep land for themselves or keep other people out. So as long as that like desire is there, then the desire for these aerial weapons will also be there. So as much as we have a lot of international effort dedicated to trying to get more and more countries to sign international bans to ban landmines and cluster munitions, you'll note that the countries that don't sign it are the ones who actively have the arsenals and have active interests in current wars to keep those types of weapons. And so it's then become this question of, how do we tie our own hands in using these types of weapons? And how do domestic audiences potentially try to force their own militaries to only use these weapons when absolutely necessary? So that's kind of the current solution that I have suggested right now, where I think in these areas where there are democracies to use as much pressure as we can to try to prevent these weapons from being used. Otherwise, it's going like the weapons are always going to be available, and there will always be a various number of non-state and state actors who will want to use them.
Yeah. No, this is really helpful. And it just draws like a key point to like how important I think your book is for highlighting these long run effects. I mean, I know in the book you talked about how Princess Diana, 30 years or so ago now, started to make debinding like a big issue. But then again, it like lost, it loses out to other causes at plenty of times. And like you say, it's pretty expensive to do. So I think it's just really important to like keep talking about these sorts of things and talking about the harm they do. Not just because, I think people will think about like, oh, like the kid, it's very easy to like have a campaign with like a kid whose hand has gotten bombed off and like try and get money that way. But to think about these other harms that, affect a lot more people than just the actual ordinance falling at a given time. So I just think the book is like really fascinating and very helpful in that sense. One question I had is, so thinking beyond just these sorts of bombs, you bring up some other issues and thinking more broadly about environmental degradation after war and how that affects things. Do you think that this argument also applies to things like the use of napalm and other sorts of long run harms that might really um, affect people?
Yes, like all the other types of weapons
Yeah.
that we're
Yeah.
inventing that also have
Yeah.
long-term effects. I do.
Yes.
Um, yes, I think there are so many spin-off projects that were related to this, partially because I think as our military technology advances, we've only found different ways to make our weapons more lethal, right? And I think there's really exciting research being done by geographers as well as some economists and area studies as like anthropologists in Southeast Asia about the effects of napalm and its use in the Vietnam War. And we're only now trying to think about like ways that we can apply our knowledge of spatial statistics and causal inference to think about how we can measure these long run effects on human health outcomes, but then also on the long-term development outcomes. So like this kind of goes back to your comment before, right? Which is that I think so far a lot of the humanitarian demining space has been focused on these like immediate, direct, violent impacts of the unexploded ordnance, and that's a narrative that donors, I don't know if they tire of, but they just, it becomes rote after a while. And so I do write in the book about how we have a lot less research about the secondary effects of our military policy. And there aren't a lot of people who are incentivized to study it. Like when you think about the military, it's a very outcomes-oriented institution. It's like a business in that way, where you have like very few DVs that you're trying to maximize. And then you don't really think like there's no one in charge of thinking about what the consequences are for what the human costs are for other people. And so I make the argument in the book that honestly, the only subset of people where all of the stars kind of align in terms of like having the skill set, the time to kind of study these issues and the space to fail, like the space to like, collect the data, run a bunch of regressions and not necessarily find stars in your coefficients, but still a worthwhile finding. Like that's academics. That's not going to necessarily be people like within the military or even within the government. So it's really this call for, graduate students and undergraduates and future academics to think about like all the different research questions that can spin off from various types of U.S. military engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's not just the US military too. It's other militaries as well. But I think it's just so interesting to think about um, when military planners, they're just planning to win the war. And even as much as we've changed our laws of war to hopefully get people thinking about civilian casualties and trying to avoid immediate civilian casualties, we don't think so much, or I would say military planners do not think so much about like what happens after the war and what happens to the economy and the development. So it's really nice to have you point this out that this could be a major problem. One question I had as I was reading, especially about the role of elites in Cambodia taking land, that I was just sort of curious about. And maybe you talked about this book and I just missed it when I was reading the book, was how do deminers like are they fully like just honest brokers, like in terms of like I find a bomb and I go do it, or do they like prioritize? So if I'm like the village head or I'm the like or I'm a local rich person, can I get them to come to my land sooner? And do we also have problems? Or, like you say about this predation of the land, do you see local elites or did you hear anything about local elites trying to be like, could you go clear that plot over there for
Mhm.
me? Or is it
Yeah.
really just sort of like an after the fact kind of thing going on?
Yes. Okay. This is great. To answer your question, I am going to be giving a short primer on how demining teams operate because it's not just a simple notion of like different types of like freelance teams or even like international teams that are just working in different areas. Each one has a different specialty. So one thing that I didn't talk about in the talk is actually like the first step of demining, which is the most dangerous step, which is I think this goes back to like let's imagine what a minefield looks like. I think most people imagine some variant of like a sandbox or just like a plot of dirt with like bombs strewn about it. What it actually is just like a piece of land that's usually overgrown. So it's like very, very weedy, barren. And so the hardest thing is to actually figure out the ways to pull out like all of like the big trees and pieces of brush that have to come out in order for you to use the metal detector properly. And so one of the other technological advancements in demining is that like we now have remote controlled like bulldozers and like cranes essentially that'll pull out trees or like basically raise land. And like they're like armed, encased with different types of like protective steel. So that way, like if they detonate a piece of ordnance, like the machine will still work. Um, so first there's like a demining team that like focuses just on clearing land of brush. Second, there are then two different types of demining operations. So there's usually what's called like a battlefield area clearance team. And that is like the team where like they get assigned a piece of land, and then they go and clear it. So this is gets to your question of like, well, how are these pieces of land chosen? The second type of team is basically an on-call team that's called an explosive ordnance disposal team. So they'll get like they have a hotline in which people will call in and say like, oh, I found a cluster bomb, I think. Like, will you come take a look at it and then detonate it if you positively ID it? And so that's a response team that functions more like 911 in the emergency sense, but not necessarily in the timeliness sense, because then there's like a queue, and where you get off the list on that queue depends usually on like the plot of where the EOT team is already trucked out to go that day, and like the number of ordnance that you think like you've found. Um, so the BAC team, the Battlefield Area Clearance Team, that is something that's determined by the organization that's running demining in the country. In Cambodia, it's interesting because the National Demining Institution, they actually are most focused on the lowest likelihood land, the lowest risk land of unexploded ordnance. And partially this is just due to their access to capital. And so it's easier for them to kind of run the dog teams and also the landmine sniffing rat teams to find the unexploded bombs. So they can kind of cover more ground, but they also have like less direct access to like the very expensive equipment compared to like the international humanitarian demining teams. And there's about 3 of them that operate in Cambodia. And because they're international, they have pretty strict guidelines and how land is prioritized. And it's pretty formulaic, to be honest. So it's all about the number of community stakeholders that are within that, like either live next to or live within that plot of land. As a result, like the land that gets cleared first tends to be land that's like near public goods areas, so schools, roads, markets. And then the explosive ordnance disposal team mostly then just targets areas that there's a lot of call-in reports. So I think there could potentially be ways that, someone could lean on the scale a little bit, call in more often, have more of a close relationship with the person who runs the EOD team. But the majority of the unexploded ordnance being cleared is through the BAC teams, and that's kind of determined by more of a formula than a personal relationship.
Cool. Yeah, no, I was just sort of curious about how that works. All right. We've got a bunch of questions. So the first one I'm going to start out with is possibly one from a student, grad student or undergrad. It was thinking about how was the process of researching data for your section on economic results? Was it difficult to find information? How did you determine what sources were reliable? And just in general, we're doing your ethnographic research. How do you, so this is like more of a methods question, especially for students who might be interested in doing this sorts of research. How do you decide who to talk to? How do you decide, when you're talking to people, like who are, how representative people are, how honest people are? And so thinking about like, how did you think about that as you went through? Like, I'm sure as you talked to elites who were stealing land, they probably weren't like, oh, I'm stealing the land. I mean, although I've been in plenty of situations where I'm talking to elites about things that like maybe we think they shouldn't be saying that they totally just say. So, could go either way. But thinking a little bit about like, how did you go about this? And so if you were talking to your grad students and explaining like how they might also do this, what are some of the pitfalls? What did you learn? Those sorts of questions of how you got on this.
Oh, these are very good questions, and they so much relate to, I think, my personal experiences as a graduate student and honestly as an assistant professor. um, so to answer the question of like, how did I collect the data? I mean, part of this is just like figuring out what my identity was as like a political scientist. I came from a graduate school program that was like heavily into econometric training and causal inference at the time. So I was part of Kosuke Imai's like first class of graduate students that he trained.
Oh my goodness. And like, look
Yes.
what you've done now.
I know. So it was like this really cool confluence, actually, because I think a lot of us started graduate school not knowing anything about statistics and causal inference. And then we like meet this hotshot professor where we're like, wow, it makes a lot of sense, like why you do the things that you do. So I think a lot of us were coming in with like these big questions or a lot of area knowledge. And then we're also learning like what it was like to be at the frontier methodologically of our field. So I went into Cambodia with the mind of an econometrician where I was like, okay, I need to collect, like I need to just meet as many people as possible who have a bunch of cool data on their hard drives and like figure out how to get it. Um, I think that was also tricky because my interest in Cambodia like predates my interest in political science. I started going to the country as an undergraduate, and then I had spent a year in between undergrad and grad school on a Fulbright, working in slums in Phnom Penh. So I knew like I wanted to study some aspect of the country, but I wasn't quite sure exactly how to do it, partially because, as I had mentioned in the talk, like Cambodia is super authoritarian. One of the reasons why you don't see a lot of political science research coming out of that country is because like you can't really ask people about their political preferences without getting in a lot of trouble. And like it's what you were saying earlier, Maggie, like you don't even know if what they're going to tell you is a falsified preference or their actual preference. And you essentially have to do like super deep like ethnographic immersion to, I think, before you start getting certain preferences revealed. Um, so that's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to study the US bombing, because it was this event that was just kind of seen as like not political. Like it was about like a country that I mean has a presence. I mean, it's about the, US involvement. So there's like a presence, there's a US presence in Cambodia, but it's, not a trigger point present. Like you can mention the US and people, I think, you know, aren't going to be scared to talk to you. But like I couldn't necessarily examine how like exposure to unexploded ordnance impacts someone's like personal political beliefs in terms of like how you feel about the incumbent party versus an opposition actor. Even though like the opposition might be more aligned with the US compared to the incumbent that's more antagonistic. But I actually found that like doing the ethnographic observation and working with farmers made it a lot easier to establish a relationship with people. Like I find that doing an interview with someone, especially if there's a language barrier, and I do speak Khmer, it's like it's just really awkward. I mean, it's like awkward to get someone to sit down, like you're asking them these questions that to some extent seem a little abstract from their everyday experience. But I did kind of luck out because in graduate school, I had this one weird hobby, which was I like worked on an organic vegetable farm for like my like second, third, and fourth years of grad school. So I knew how to farm, like I knew how to like weed things, I knew how to plant things, like I knew how to harvest things without like breaking the plant. And so like I would go in and, I was interested in this project in like the parts of the environmental contamination around unexploded ordnance. So I'd also actually soil tested soils for farmers to see if there are like high amounts of heavy metal contaminants near their the areas where they found a lot of bombs. And so like they were very interested in this test to understand like if they could actually eat the things that were produced from the soil nearby. And then like we just go out and farm together, and like that's when like I would learn about like all of these like avoidance techniques and like the ways like you shuffle your feet to leave a lighter footprint, kind of like on like Dune actually. And like that's how I was like getting a lot of like interesting information, but also just like buy-in from my respondents. So like to answer your question about like how do you know if someone's lying to you? I mean it's the same thing about like how do you know if someone's lying to you in real life? And I would say you triangulate it like I would always try to like meet the people that others were talking about so I could get like some people's perspectives and then like what that own person's perspective would be on the problem. And then I like that was nice to have all the statistical data too. So like when village elders were telling me about their own personal experiences during the US bombing, like I could then actually like map it on in terms of like getting like quantity amounts from the payload drop data. So yeah, I mean some of it is just like going out to the field, repeating um, meetings with people and triangulating what they're saying, and then also triangulating it with other pools of data.
Yeah. What I really liked about the chapter on like interethnic relations, and this is something again for those of you who are interested in research and how to do it, is that you did talk to sort of like all sorts of different people in the community and got different perspectives from everybody in the community. And it just helped like both flesh out the picture, but also get a sense of like what are the both the stereotypes, but then also sort of like the meta perceptions people have about each other's stereotypes about each other, and like how real are they versus like are they not right? And thinking about those sorts of things is just a really great way for thinking about if you're interested, in ethnic conflict or ethnic, relations. It just is a really nice chapter for understanding that. From a really nice sort of viewpoint that you have there. Again, yeah. For those of you who are UCLA uh, um, affiliated, I highly recommend the book, and the library owns an online copy, so you can just go to the library. As I was saying in our last talk, like, sorry, Erin, I'm costing you the 25 cents you would have gotten from the the book, but you do. All right. So the next set of questions, since we're sort of running down in time, are, how do you recommend, or like, are there groups you would recommend to support Cambodia in these areas? So somebody mentioned Heidi Kuhn's organization, Roots of Peace, and other person just asked, like, are there specific organizations you can recommend? Or government policies, like basically how could we help if somebody's interested in helping Cambodian communities? How would you say is the best way to help?
Oh, this is a very good question. Because I do actually feel a lot of optimism about this issue, even though I think the talk that I gave was like very sad. Um, and part of it is because like now having kind of have like having my feet grounded in the unexploded ordnance topic as well as the humanitarian demining community, there's like a lot of enthusiasm and effort towards not only removing unexploded ordnance, but thinking about like what are the most responsible ways to do it, and thinking about like, well, what are the implications? So I think there are organizations that like actively ask these questions, and it was kind of nice to be both a graduate student and an assistant professor, like of relatively low status, like doing field work in Cambodia, where I was kind of like able to just like come in as a researcher and see how like these different international demining teams operated and have different types of experiences with them. So there's one group that I do work with called the Mines Advisory Group. And they ended up being my partners both in Cambodia in terms of giving me access to a lot of their demining teams where I was able to observe them, write about them. And I also was very happy how they were able to essentially introduce me to a lot of their stakeholders and like essentially the village chiefs that I needed permission from in order to then meet and interview a lot of their constituents. Um, and like, I think one reason why I liked working with that organization so much is that like they just wanted me to do good research. I think they recognize they're like, there's not a lot of people who do research on this area and like not a lot of people who do it quantitatively. And if they do it quantitatively, they don't really know the area that well. So I think they liked how I was able to kind of blend the two together. But then I was also interested in like these larger scale issues of, how unexploded ordnance impacts poverty and food security. And so I think from that, I've had like this nice now, like 5-year long relationship with the organization, where, they now they want a lot of academic advice and guidance in terms of like thinking about best ways to design similar projects in different areas to figure out how some of these findings might scale. So I recommend, I think, that organization either to provide you more information or to see if you could support them in any way that they might need. Because I can say firsthand, I do think that the work that they do in Cambodia is great and constantly evolving because they are asking themselves these self-reflective questions of what other supports can we give to the communities who both like ask for the demining, but then also ask for the support and some of the legal advisors that they would need to kind of help them keep their land.
Yeah. What was the name of that again?
Mines Advisory Group, the acronym is MAG.
I'm just putting that in the chat for everybody. If you're interested in it, go check it out. I'm sure they have a website you can go to. All right. So one last question coming from the audience is, okay, so the question is, you mentioned difficulty in detecting landmines or other unexploded ordnances. Are there preventative measures that could be implemented in regions where mines are used or where we have huge bombing campaigns that would make future clearance efforts more efficient?
Yes. I mean, in some ways, the R&D labs of the military are trying to figure out how do you make a more responsible cluster bomb. So, for example, like, can you just set off required timers in which, like, at a certain time, 24 hours later, like, the bomb must detonate. I would say, like, those technologies exist, and we do produce certain generations of bombs that do have these kind of like timed functions. But at the same time, it's really tricky because a lot of the unexploded ordnance or the cluster bombs that we still produce to this day don't have those precautions because they're just more expensive to put them in. And again, like there is just a high enough demand that to make these bombs cheaply, that people are going to be more responsive to cost than they are to necessarily like moral obligations to the civilians. I think the other thing that I mentioned more in the book, and I don't think I got to in this talk, is that like what's dangerous is that the US is on like the frontier of, I think, producing the most advanced military weapons in the world. The problem is that like once we produce a weapon that is both effective but also very like cheap to manufacture, that gets reverse engineered in every main military industry in all the other countries. So like the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians in this case, they're all producing like versions of our basic entry level cluster munitions and landmines that are then used all around the world. So even if we're able on the technological front to kind of solve a cluster munition issue for future wars that the US might be engaged in. Granted, like the US actually has more domestic hand-tying instruments to prevent us from actively using cluster munitions in most military operations compared to many other countries. But you still will have this problem of the unexploded ordnance existing from all of the other makers of these cluster munitions.
Yeah, and that's so true. And then, even if we do it, like you said, other countries may or may not do it. We also might have old supplies that we're like, sure, we'll sell it cheaply to the so-and-sos. Even if Congress was to say, like, we want you to use the ones that make sure it explodes, we'll be like, okay, well, we'll sell our stockpiles to whomever that, like, some sort of ally, the Egyptians or the Saudis or the somebody else, and it'll just still be there. And so that is what makes this also tough. And even thinking about like we still have so much left to clean too from earlier generations of these wars. Well, I wanted to thank you so much. We're at time for such an interesting talk and such an interesting book. As I mentioned, we've put a link into the chat about how to purchase the book. If you're interested, especially if you are a grad student or undergrad and you are poor, check out the local, UCLA library. And we'll see you soon. And we'll be back after the Thanksgiving break with another talk with Matt Furman. So thank you all so much for coming. And we will see you. Hopefully we'll see you all again soon. And it was great chatting, Erin.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.